Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, and this is a deck that is extremely high power level, and you could consider it in contention for CEDH playability. But basically this deck revolves around Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. It has two effects which are both highly relevant. It's a 3-mana 2/3, and it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power, and green and tap, add X mana in any combination of colors where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So we want to be either playing creatures that have really big power or buffing the power of Selvala herself in order so that her mana adding ability can add a ton of mana and then draw a bunch of cards and win the game. So this deck is broken into a lot of different categories. We've got our big creatures. We've got our card draw, most of which relies on big creatures. We've got our commander backups. These are cards that function the same way that Selvala does and can be backups in case Selvala is dealt with. We've got pump effects. We've got our ramp, of course. We've got fast mana, combo pieces. We've got protection, and then we've got our lands, and we've got untapper effects that we can use to untap Selvala. So let's go through these one at a time. So first of all, we have our big creatures. So these are creatures that are going to cost 3 or less, and they just have really big power and probably don't do anything else. They're just in here so that Selvala can tap for a whole bunch. So as long as you've got 2 to 3 mana in order to cast them, plus the last one in order to tap Selvala, you can generate a ton of mana. So we've got Groundbreaker. Effect is totally irrelevant. It's just a 6/1 for 3. We've got Lupine Prototype. Once again, the effect is completely irrelevant. It's just a 5/5. And then I'm going to skip this one for now. We've got Phyrexian Soul Gorger, 3 mana 8/8. But it has cumulative upkeep, sack a creature. So you either need to sack a creature, probably like one of your random mana dorks, or you need to just try to win the same turn you play this. Ravaging Riftworm, again, the effect is completely irrelevant. It's just a 3 mana 6/6. Same thing here, Relic Golem, 3 mana 6/6. Ronus the Indomitable, which is a 3 mana 5/5, but it's also relevant because his activated ability means you can pump either Selvala or himself or other creatures. And he's an infinite mana outlet, meaning once you get to infinite mana, you can just overrun your entire board, giving them infinite power and trample. So this one's ability is actually relevant. And then Sheltering Ancient is a 2 mana 5/5, whose ability is also once again irrelevant. The cumulative upkeep cost of putting a +1 counter on a creature an opponent controls is so marginal that it doesn't matter, but it does actually require that your opponent has a creature in play. If somehow your 3 opponents, none of them have any creatures in play, then you will have to sack this to the cumulative upkeep cost. And then the best one of the bunch, Phyrexian Dreadnought. 1 mana 12/12 trample. When it enters, sack any number of creatures with total power 12 or destroy it, or sack it, basically. So we can't keep this around, but we can, with the sack trigger on the stack, activate Selvala and make 12 mana. And if we have any way of untapping Selvala at instant speed, we can untap it and produce even more mana. So Phyrexian Dreadnought is often our best creature and the best thing to pair with Selvala because it just makes so much mana. And it doesn't matter that it dies, because you make minimum 12 or more if you can untap Selvala before it dies. Also, because all of these creatures have really high power and they're often going to be the creature with the highest power on the board, playing any of them triggers Selvala to draw a card. So next, we then have the cards that pair with those. So we've got a bunch of card draw. Garruk Primal Hunter, Greater Good, Last March of the Ents, Life's Legacy, Momentous Fall, Return of the Wild Speaker, Rishkar's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty are all cards that draw cards based on how high of the power level of the creature we have. So if Selvala is in play and has a bunch of power, we draw a bunch of cards that way. Or if we have one of these creatures in play, we draw a bunch of cards that way. That's another way that Phyrexian Dreadnought can be useful. If we've got a way to sack it at instant speed like Momentous Fall, we can draw a ton of cards off of that. Next, there is Recycle, which again I think is one of the most underplayed cards in EDH. You draw a card whenever you play a land or cast any spell. And then Skull Clamp, because this deck is playing a bunch of cheap mana dorks, and we're also playing a bunch of creatures that we don't actually care if we sack them. So we might sack them to like Greater Good or some other effect, and we can draw even more cards off the Skull Clamp in that case. So then we've got all of our various ramp. We've got our fast mana and Elvish Spirit God Lotus Petal. We've got Arbor Elf, Birds, Burl, Carpet Flowers, etc., etc., etc. Jeweled Lotus might be a consideration in this deck, although I find oftentimes that you need to just have mana regardless of Selvala being in play. So because you do need to be able to like cast these other things anyway. So often cheating Selvala into play off of just fast mana doesn't wind up actually being that good. Typically, the curve that you want to do is you want to have a turn 1 permanent mana source, like any of these Mana Dorks or like Soul Ring or something, and then turn 2 play Selvala, and then turn 3 try to win. But Jeweled Lotus might be in contention here. It's just that these fast mana cards can usually be played like in addition to Selvala, so you'd have to cut something else if you wanted Jeweled Lotus to be in here. It's like one of those iffy cards. So then we have the pump spells that we can use to, if we have a big creature already, we can pump that creature, or we can just pump Selvala. So we've got Aspect of Hydra, which at minimum is going to be +2, although usually, we're not playing Selvala unless it's off of like a turn 1 Mana Dork, so it's usually going to be +3, and then it's at least +4 if we've got more than that, and it can potentially be more than that. Although there's arguments that maybe it shouldn't be Aspect of Hydra and it should be Groundswell and then play fetch lands, but regardless, this is one of the pump spells you can play, although it is probably the weakest of them. Then we've got Embiggen. This is +4 minimum because it counts legendary creature Elf Scout, so it's +4 for 1. Invigorate we can play for free. We don't care that our opponents gain life, so it's just 0 mana +4. Might of Old Krosa is +4 because we don't have to go to combat or anything. We can just play it in our main phase and then get the +4 off the Might of Old Krosa. Then we've got Phyto Burst, which is 2 mana, but it gives +5. And then Scale Up is 1 mana to give equivalent. It's the equivalent of giving +4 since it changes the power to 6. Also, if we're ever in a position where we dump a bunch of creatures into play, we can just overload Scale Up and make everything huge. So next, there's the untapping effect. Selvala is, of course, great to untap because she keeps making more mana. So this is good if you either already have Selvala at a high power or if you already have a big creature in play. So the untaps are Aim High, 2 mana +2 on untap. It gets Reach. Any additional abilities are typically not going to be relevant, like Reach, Trample, whatever. Typically, the part that matters is untapping her and how much pump can you give her. So Aim High, Arachnoid Adaptation is +2 untap and Reach, but it's only for 1 mana. Benefactor's Draw doesn't pump, but it does untap her and all of your other creatures, and you draw a card. So it's whatever mana you can generate off Selvala plus whatever mana you can generate off of other Mana Dorks. Boon of Boseiju is +X, where X is the greatest mana value, meaning it's at least +3 on Selvala, and it untaps. Bull Strength, +2 untap. Gift of Growth is +2 untap, although you can kick it to give +4, but that's 4 mana. Instill Energy, this one's really relevant. It might be hard to read on the screen, but it's an aura that does 2 things. It basically lets you untap and then lets you have haste. So it's like haste and untap. Then there's Legolas's Quick Reflexes, which is from the Lord of the Rings Commander decks. It has Split Second, untap target creature. Until end of turn, it gains Hexproof Reach, and whenever this creature becomes tapped, it deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature. So one of the things is, this deck is pretty glass cannon. It fails very hard if your opponent counters Selvala or just kills Selvala. So this can be used to protect her. Now, other cards can also be used to protect her, like Blossoming Calm or whatever, but typically, like, those cards are maybe good. I like this one because it's uncounterable because of Split Second, and because giving her the ability to deal damage equal to her power whenever she becomes tapped pairs well with all of the other untap effects by making you able to continue to untap and go again. And Legolas's Quick Reflexes in combination with other cards in the deck can actually be its own win con, allowing you to win the game by continuously tapping and untapping Selvala over and over to just burn everyone out. Then you've got Quirion Ranger to untap, and Quirion Ranger is also part of combos. Same thing with Wirewood Symbiote to untap her and be part of combos. We've got Savage Surge +2 untap, Scrib Ranger, and again, untapping and part of combos, and then Witch's Web +3 and untap and Reach, but again, the Reach doesn't matter. We do want Selvala potentially to be able to be activated immediately. The turn she's played, or if she's killed, be able to recast and activate her immediately. So we've got Concordant Crossroads to give haste. We've got our tutors to go find creatures, some of which are combo pieces, but these can also just find our big creatures to get Selvala to trigger to draw or just make a bunch of mana. So we've got Natural Order, GSZ, Finale of Devastation, and Finale also doubles as a great way to be a mana outlet, either just big mana or infinite to pump the whole team, and Eldritch Evolution and Chord of Calling. It's also great that Dreadnought is our best creature to have on the board, and it is the easiest one to find off of all of these tutors minus GSZ and Natural Order, obviously. Turn Timber Symbiosis is in here just because it's a land that can also be a way to put a big creature into play later in the game, although that's probably in desperation mode if you're ever casting this. And then a lot of times in this deck, Selvala can get killed or countered, and then you might be able to replay it, but even playing it for 5 mana is a lot. And if you ever get past that, it becomes just too much of an ask to be able to recast Selvala. So you have other cards in the deck that can act as additional copies of Selvala, basically. So Viridian Joiner taps for green equal to its power. Priest of Titania taps for green equal to the number of elves you control, and there are a lot of mana elves in this deck. Marwyn taps equal to its power, and Kami taps equal to its power. So all of these cards can also pair up with the various pump and untap spells, and Priest can pair up with the amount of elves that you have. So you can potentially make a bunch of mana just off of these guys. This also isn't all of the creatures that do this. There's like Karametra's Acolyte. There's another prototype artifact card from Brothers War that does the same thing. But you don't need too many of them, and these are the best ones among them that do the same kind of effect. Like Elvish Archdruid would be a 3 mana version of Priest of Titania, but you don't, strictly speaking, need it. Now, of course, all of them are worse than Selvala because Selvala has more things that it combos with. Like, none of these actually work with the big creatures, but these are backups in case Selvala is dealt with. And then apart from all that, you've got your combo cards. So these are going to pair up with a lot of different things. So first is Temur Sabertooth, which allows you to bounce a creature for 2 mana, not itself, but bounce any other creature. So this combos in a ton of different ways. First of all, if you have a way to give Selvala haste, like Concordant Crossroads, for example, and there's like a big creature that's already in play, you can bounce Selvala and replay her and tap her potentially for more mana than it costs to bounce and replay her. So you need 2 mana for Sabertooth, 3 mana to cast Selvala, and 1 mana to activate her. So as long as you're at least producing 7 mana per activation, which can be done either by a creature that has more than 7 or more power, or by pumping one of those creatures, you can Temur Sabertooth Selvala over and over and over to generate infinite mana. And then, since you have infinite mana, you can use Temur Sabertooth to pick up whatever the biggest creature in play is and replay that and draw infinite cards off of Selvala and win the game. Or you can combo it with other things like Great Oak Guardian. So Great Oak Guardian is none of the abilities on this matter except for the third one, which is ATB, creatures target player controls get +2/+2 and untap them. So it gives +2 to itself, Selvala, and an untapped Selvala. So you can play Great Oak Guardian, untapping Selvala, and then since Great Oak Guardian becomes a 6/7, Selvala will tap for 6, and then you can bounce Great Oak with the Sabertooth, replay it, do that over and over and over. The Great Oak Guardian will always be the greatest power level in play for a little bit before Selvala starts to become huge, but it doesn't matter. You just Temur Sabertooth, Great Oak Guardian, bounce over and over and over, keep untapping Selvala. Selvala will eventually have a power that is surpassing Great Oak Guardian, at which point it just generates tons of mana. You generate infinite mana, and then at that point you can bounce Selvala back to your hand with Sabertooth, and then bounce Great Oak back to your hand, and then recast Great Oak because you have infinite mana, and recast Selvala, triggering because now you have a new greatest power in play, and then just keep bouncing both of them back and forth to draw your whole deck and win that way. You can also, with Temur Sabertooth and Ewit, bounce the Ewit to your hand and get other cards back that you may need to get in order to go infinite. Also, you have other combos that can do other things. So Tooth and Nail can go fetch the combo cards that you need. You've got Cloudstone Curio, which does a similar type of thing as Temur Sabertooth by allowing you to bounce creatures back and forth. And then Umbral Mantle, which can go infinite with just Selvala or one of your other creatures. So Umbral Mantle is 3 mana and it's 3 mana, but it's 0 to equip, and then it's 3 mana to untap the creature, and it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So as long as you have enough initial starting mana to invest in, the Umbral Mantle will allow you to go infinite with Selvala because you equip it to Selvala. Selvala untaps and gets an increased power. Then you tap Selvala for mana, then you untap and pump Selvala again, and you make infinite mana off of Selvala. This also works with your other power-based tappers like Viridian Joiner, Marwyn, and Kami. And then you also have Staff of Domination, which itself can untap creatures. So as long as those creatures can produce more mana, like you have a Selvala and you have like a Groundbreaker in play, the staff costs 3 to activate to untap the Selvala. It costs 1 to untap itself, and then it costs 1 to activate Selvala. So as long as you're making 6 mana in each iteration, you're generating infinite mana, and then the staff can draw your whole deck. You also have Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. It makes all of your non-token creatures into forests. So it essentially Dryad arborizes all of your creatures, including itself. So depending on how many creatures you already have in play, it itself can be really big. And then you can potentially untap creatures, bouncing itself or bouncing other creatures. So, for example, you've got Quirion Ranger and Scrib Ranger, which have to bounce forests to your hand in order to untap things. So since Ashaya itself is a forest, if Selvala is producing enough mana, you can bounce Ashaya itself and then replay Ashaya. You can also, in combination with Wirewood Symbiote, since the Wirewood Symbiote and the Quirion Ranger will both be forests, the Wirewood can bounce the Quirion Ranger can bounce the Wirewood. With Ashaya in play, you can use these to bounce each other back and forth, untapping Selvala each time, generating infinite mana, or potentially infinite draw triggers, assuming Ashaya is big enough. There's lots and lots and lots of combinations where these go infinite with each other. But everything always involves getting Selvala up to a high power level, and then untapping it, or just drawing tons of cards off of our card draw spells. Anyway, this deck is very glass cannon because it mostly, although you have some backups to Selvala, it mostly relies around Selvala. So if it gets countered or killed, the deck stumbles a lot. So it's very important to have cards like Allosaurus Shepherd and Cavern of Souls and Veil of Summer to make sure that you get through the counter spells. And it's important to have backups in case Selvala is dealt with and ways to generate lots of mana. Also, sometimes this deck can just straight up brick. Like sometimes you have a bunch of mana, but you don't actually have a way to draw cards to pay that off. Anyways, eventually you will be in a position where you're making a ton of mana, potentially infinite mana, and potentially drawing your whole deck, at which point there are a number of different ways to win the game. One is Ronus the Indomitable. You simply pump your entire team, give them all trample and infinite power, and then overrun the opponent. If you don't have haste, you can give them haste with Concordant Crossroads, or sometimes this deck will play Craterhoof Behemoth or some other way to overrun the opponent. You can also get to infinite mana and use Finale of Devastation to give everything plus infinite power and haste, and then overrun the opponent that way. If you don't have infinite power, but you just have somehow, like if you don't have infinite mana, but you just somehow have tons of mana and card draw, but you never actually find a way to go infinite, you can just put a ton of creatures into play and pump them all. You can also use Umbral Mantle with your Monodorks and move the Umbral Mantle between the different Monodorks to give them all infinite power. So let's say you have Umbral Mantle plus Selvala. You give Selvala infinite power and infinite mana, and then you just move the Umbral Mantle onto your other Monodorks, give them infinite power, and then kill your opponent with those, particularly like Birds of Paradise that can fly. That's another way to do it. But a lot of the time, you are just going to be drawing your entire deck and then winning by overrunning the opponent with your whole team. Some versions of the deck will run like a single copy of Beast Within, and then they'll bounce their Eternal Witness and then Beast Within everything the opponent plays. But usually you should be able to just win by overrunning the opponent with the combat step. There's also some other cards that I've elected not to play in this deck. So Sword of the Parunes is another artifact that's similar to Umbral Mantle that untaps creatures, but it's much more expensive. And I found that when using it, it's usually not very good. There's other cards like Berserk that you might wonder about why they're not here. Berserk is typically only good when you've already pumped one of your creatures, and when you haven't, then it winds up being bad. Also, there's times when Selvala just bricks, so if you Berserk your Selvala and then you just don't get there, then Selvala dies, and then you sometimes just can't recast it. But otherwise, yeah, the basic game plan is get out either a really big creature or put enough pump effects on Selvala to make tons of mana, untap it to make even more mana, and then play cards that draw tons of cards, find a bunch of cards in your deck, and either go infinite with one of the infinite combos, or just draw a ton, make a ton of mana, and then overrun the opponent. And that is Selvala, Heart of the Wilds.